Released in 1945 by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and directed by John Ford, starring Robert Montgomery, John Wayne, and Donna Reed. Now, Rob was just mentioning my book, Behind the Scenes of They Were Expendable, which is available through Amazon. But I just want to tell you why I wrote a book about They Were Expendable. I was not that familiar with the film back in 2012. I had seen it only once. But in 2012, I received an email from a very good friend of mine. His name is Dan Burke, and I've known Dan for 40 years. And Dan and I would go out to lunch together, talk about movies. He was an avid movie buff like myself. And one day he sent me an email, and there was a photograph. And Rick, let's do the first picture. This is the first picture he sent me in an email. And he asked me, he said, Lou, can you identify this photograph? And there were two pictures in the email. And I said, yeah, well, the fellow lying down there is John Ford. And the three fellows up there, that's Robert Montgomery on the left. And then you have Jack Holt, then you have John Wayne. I said, this is obviously a production still from They Were Expendable. And the next picture, number 2, is a picture of Robert Montgomery sitting in a military vehicle, but I wasn't able to identify the young sailor sitting on the left. As a matter of fact, that's the cover of my book. As it turned out, the man sitting on the left is the fellow who took the first picture. His name is Nick Scuddy. He's still with us, God bless him. He is going to be celebrating his 91st birthday on January 21st. He's in great shape. And he took the first picture for the book. And I asked Dan, I didn't know Nick from Adam. I said, where does Nick live? He said, well, he lives in Stamford, Connecticut, which is where I reside. That's my hometown. And my mother was alive at the time, and I asked my mom, hey, Ma, do you know a fellow named Nick Scuddy? She said, yeah, he was my brother Bert's best friend. As a matter of fact, you met him at a restaurant a few weeks ago when you took us out to dinner. I said, oh, wow, so that's Nick Scuddy. So in a haste, I called Nick, and I thought, he spent a day on the set of They Were Expendable. Perhaps I can interview him and maybe write an article for our local newspaper and maybe Classic Images. So I called him up, and he said, yeah, I'll do an interview with you, Lou. Sure, that's great. And I brought my wife, Susan, with me, and she brought her laptop, and I made a little questionnaire. And when I got to his house, he invited me in, and I sat down, and I said, Nick, so tell me something. You were on the set of They Were Expendable. He said, yeah. I said, how long were you there? How many hours? He said, how many hours? I was there for 30 days. I said, wait a minute, you were there for the whole location shooting of They Were Expendable? And he said, yeah. And I said, and you only took one picture? He said, Lou, wait a minute. So he walked out of the room, and he came back, and he came out with this big box about this thick. Well, there were 153 photographs. And he said to me, and I didn't look at him yet. I said, well, where were you situated when you took these pictures? He said, right behind Mr. Ford. I said, well, did you get to talk to John Wayne? He said, yeah. I said, well, what about Robert Montgomery? Of course. John Ford? Yes. And so I was flabbergasted. So as I was going through these pictures and seeing these treasures never before seen, I said, Nick, we've got a book. And as a matter of fact, I think this is the first time a book has ever chronicled the filming of a 70-year-old motion picture. So we put the book together, and we came up with Behind the Scenes of They Were Expendable. And it's pretty much a picture book, but it talks about the filming of the movie and the background of the film, and also about the two real-life heroes the film is based on, Lieutenants John Bulkley and James Kelly. And I'm going to show you a few photographs from the book and tell you a few stories, what happened behind the scenes of They Were Expendable when they were filming. And mind you, these pictures have never been seen by anybody in over 70 years. So let's go to the next photograph. Now this was, John Ford and all his biographers have always claimed that They Were Expendable was filmed in Key Biscayne, the location shooting. Well, according to Nick Scuddy, they didn't step foot on Key Biscayne. Most of the film was shot in Miami Beach, And there were 2 islands, 20 minutes, it would take about 20 minutes to go out on a PT boat. And one they would call, they were uninhabited, and one island they just called the Coconut Island, and the other one was the Palm Island. One because there was an abundance of coconuts on one island and palm trees on another, and that's where they built a lot of the sets. So this was the morning of the first day of shooting, and the actors, the main actors like Robert Montgomery and John Wayne and Jack Holt, they're not wearing any shirts, and the reason for that, they didn't want to perspire through their costumes. A lot of the pictures, the actors don't have their shirts because it was hot in Miami after all. But they were just about ready to board one of the PT boats that day, and Nick walked up with his camera. Nick was a photographer, and he worked for the Sub-Chaser Division of the U.S. Navy. And during the day, he was free. At night, he would work at the lab. So during the day, he was on the set every day taking these pictures. So this is the first picture he took, and he walked up to John Wayne, and he said, "Mr. Wayne, can I take your picture?" And he goes, "Sure, if you'll give me a cigarette." And he's holding the cigarette in his hand right there. And that's the first picture. And he said he was really a really nice guy. Let's go to the next picture. Before we talk about this picture, I just want to tell you what happened. So they got on the PT boat, and there were no seats. And Nick sat down on the deck, and he was at the feet of somebody, you know, he thought he was some high official in the Navy. It turned out to be John Ford. And during the 20-minute ride while they were going to one of the islands, John Ford sat next to Nick, and he said, "So, son, how long have you been in the Navy?" And he said, "Well, I just joined." And he said, "Well, what do you do back home?" He said, "Well, I want to be a still photographer. I want to be a professional photographer." And John Ford, you know, there were so many stories about how cantankerous he was as a director. I mean, he used to berate all of his actors constantly, especially John Wayne and Ward Bond. And he said to Nick, he said, "Well, you know what? I'm going to introduce you to the MGM studio still photographer, Burt Lynch." And he did. And Burt took Nick under his wing, and Nick told me, he said he learned almost all of his craft in that month that he was hanging around with Burt Lynch. Now this picture here that we're taking a look at was taken at lunchtime. It's kind of cropped, but on the left is John Wayne, and on the right is Ward Bond. In the center is one of Nick Scuddy's friends. And Nick and his friend were walking by, and John Wayne and Ward Bond just had finished lunch. They were on lunch break. And Nick had his camera with him, his trusty camera, and he walked up to Ward Bond, and he said, "Mr. Bond, can I take your picture?" And he said, "Nah, get the hell out of here." And John Wayne stopped me. He said, "Whoa, Ward, wait a minute." He said, "Son, go ahead, take the picture." And you could see Ward Bond is covering his face. He didn't want the picture being taken. But John Wayne turned his chair around, and there's another accompanying still of this young man. His name was St. Clair, I believe. Louis St. Pierre, I'm sorry. Louis St. Pierre. He took a companion photograph of Nick sitting there, and Ward Bond has his arms down, but he wouldn't look at the camera. Next picture, please. The next day, Nick and Louis St. Pierre were walking on the set of They Were Expendable. And hobbling down the set was Ward Bond. He had a broken leg, and he was walking with a crutch. He was in a car accident. He broke his foot, actually. And Nick and Louis said, "Oh, we don't want anything to do with this guy. Forget him." And Ward Bond said, "Hey, sailors, come over here. You want to take my picture now?" So Louis St. Pierre took this picture of Nick with Ward Bond. Ward was 6'2", and you know, he's holding his gut in, and I think it's kind of a cute picture of the two of them. Next picture. This is an interesting one. John Ford had always stated there was a scene in They Were Expendable which never made it to the final cut. It ended up on the cutting room floor of a Catholic priest played by Wallace Ford. Well, it wasn't played by Wallace Ford. The actor you see there is Pedro de Cordova. So John Ford was suffering from a bad memory at the time. And there are other existing stills in the book of the chapel that you see fleetingly in the film, right after the scene that was cut was supposed to appear. Next picture. Okay, film buffs, there were some very important visitors to the set of They Were Expendable. Anybody in the audience know who that is? Oh, I know you know. Okay, go ahead, Larry.
Richard Barthelmess.
Yes, that's silent film great Richard Barthelmess, who started off with D.W. Griffith, the great D.W. Griffith. And Richard Barthelmess happened to visit the set of They Were Expendable, and he was a lieutenant commander at the time in the Navy. And there are no photographs of John Wayne with Richard Barthelmess because Wayne was not in the Navy. Ford would always tell John Wayne when any visitors would come who were important, Ford would tell John Wayne to go away. So, poor John Wayne. Next picture. That's, of course, Robert Montgomery. And Robert Montgomery, a lot of people have always said that he was rather aloof on the set and rather seemed kind of conceited and condescending to people who spoke with him. But Nick Scuddy said that wasn't the case. He was a very nice guy, a very private man. And every day when they would serve lunch, there would be a line going to, they'd pick up their little lunch boxes of, they'd have a sandwich, an apple, some carrots or whatever. And Nick said that he would let the cast and crew and all the naval dignitaries go before him. He would wait till everybody was served their lunch. But one day, he was standing in line, and he turned around and he happened to see that Robert Montgomery was three men behind him. And he turned around and he said, "Mr. Montgomery, hey, why don't you come in front of me? You could cut the line." And Robert Montgomery looked at him and he said, "No thanks, son. We're all the same here." Which I think is a great story. By the way, the picture on the cover with Nick and Robert Montgomery, when Nick's friend, Louis St. Pierre, took that photograph, Robert Montgomery was having his lunch. And he would never sit with the cast and crew for lunch. He would venture off by himself and eat by himself. And one day he was sitting in this military vehicle having lunch, and Nick happened to walk by and he said, "Can we take your picture, Mr. Montgomery?" He said, "Sure. And fellas, would you like to have lunch with me?" So he sat with Robert Montgomery. And, I mean, there's so many great stories, and it's so terrific that Nick remembers all these great stories. And just by looking at the pictures again and having them enlarged and enhanced, all this was coming back to him. Next picture. This picture, by the way, is a favorite of John Wayne's son, Ethan. As a matter of fact, when I was going to write this book, I met a lot of people involved with John Ford. I met John Ford's grandson, Dan Ford, and I also got to talk to Ethan Wayne, John Wayne's son, who helped me quite a bit with the book, and so did Dan Ford. And but Ethan Wayne wanted all the photographs in this picture. He said, "Lou, once the book is published, could I have all these pictures to use for the John Wayne Cancer Foundation?" I said, "Sure." And that's the picture they used. So Nick Scuddy is certainly deserved of all the plaudits he's getting with that photograph. As a matter of fact, I saw that in an ad for Turner Classic Movies. And now you all know the photographer of that picture is Nick Scuddy. Next picture. That might be the last one. No. Okay, this is a great one. This is Robert Montgomery and Ward Bond. And no, this is not a scene from the movie. They did not get along on the film, and Nick captured this in a picture. Apparently, Montgomery didn't like Ward Bond because he said the guy used to prance around like he was a star. And John Wayne used to have to get between the two of them because they would get pretty intense. They would get into pretty intense arguments. Okay, next one. This is a great picture that Nick took. He took this on a ladder. And they're taking a shot of the movie. That's the photographer, Joe August, and they're shooting a picture with Robert Montgomery. And you have the stagehand up there holding the palm in front of him to get the lighting effect. I love that picture. Okay, next one. Or is that might be it. No, we've got one more. There it is, okay. Wayne and Montgomery used to clown around on the set, and there are numerous shots of the two of them fooling around with binoculars and other assorted paraphernalia. This one Nick took, he said to John Wayne and Robert Montgomery, "Can you guys try to be serious for a minute?" And in that picture, they're trying to stifle their laughter. So, and in closing, I just want to tell you that They Were Expendable, in my opinion, is one of the finest World War II films ever made about our PT boat squadron, which was stationed in the Philippines in the early days of the war. It was beautifully directed by John Ford, almost poetic, and photographed by Joseph August, who worked on other films like The Whole Town's Talking for Ford, The Informer, and Mary of Scotland. And to quote my good friend and mentor, film historian William K. Everson, They Were Expendable was an odd film indeed to make at the close of the war. Its sadness and melancholy hardly matched the jubilation of the period. So here it is, in 35mm and glorious black and white. I hope you enjoy the movie. Here is They Were Expendable.